At the Staples Center in Los Angeles, on the night of March 14, 2002, 20,000 people had come to watch the WrestleMania press event that the WWE had organized as a promotional showcase for their biggest pay-per-view of the year. The floor seats had been filled since 6 in the evening. The upper decks were standing room. The press risers along the east wall held 73 credentialed journalists, 17 camera operators, and 4 television broadcasters whose combined reach touched 40 million households. The air inside the arena smelled of popcorn and floor wax, and the particular electricity that only comes when a crowd of that size is waiting for something it has been told will be extraordinary. He was 29 years old that night, 6 feet 5 inches tall, 262 pounds of structured muscle that he had built over 11 years of disciplined training, beginning in the weight rooms of the University of Miami, where he had played defensive tackle on a national championship roster. His name was Dwayne Johnson. Though the world had already begun calling him by the name the WWE had given him, and that name had weight. His professional record as a performer spoke plainly: 4 world championship reigns in 3 years, a crossover film deal already signed with Universal, a magazine cover count in the previous 18 months that exceeded 47 separate publications across 3 continents. He had arrived at the Staples Center that evening in a black Suburban with a 4-man security detail, and the crowd had recognized him from the moment the vehicle door opened. They had screamed his name for 90 seconds before he reached the building entrance. In the next 31 seconds, something would happen on the floor of that arena that none of those 20,000 people would fully understand until years afterward. Nobody in that building knew they were about to watch a man of that size and that confidence go very quiet, very still, and very careful. The event had been running for 2 hours and 40 minutes by the time the incident occurred. There had been contract signings, belt presentations, a 15-minute documentary reel, and a panel discussion involving 4 WWE executives and 2 sports journalists. The Rock had completed his scheduled appearance at the microphone with the precision and ease of a man who had spent the previous decade learning how to occupy a stage. He was comfortable in front of crowds the way certain men are comfortable in their own living rooms, which is to say, he did not adjust to the space so much as he simply expanded to fill it. The audience gave him everything he asked for, and he gave it back with interest, and by the end of his scheduled remarks, the arena noise had reached a level that the sound engineers on the mixing board later described as the loudest sustained crowd response they had recorded in 18 months of working that venue. He had walked off the stage to a standing response from half the floor. And then, in the corridor behind the press riser on the east wall, a production assistant named Marcus Webb had pointed toward a man sitting alone at a table near the equipment staging area. The man was wearing a gray Henley shirt and dark trousers and a tan canvas cap pulled low over his forehead. He had a cup of coffee on the table in front of him, and he was not looking at the stage. He was not looking at the crowd. He was watching the cables on the floor with the focused, unhurried attention of a man with nowhere else to be. He was 51 years old. He had been sitting at that table for 22 minutes without drawing the attention of anyone except Marcus Webb and one security coordinator who had initially asked to see his credentials before recognizing, with visible discomfort, that credentials were not a concept that fully applied here. The production assistant had said 2 words to the man walking past. The Rock had stopped. He had turned around. What happened in the following minutes would be described differently by each of the 11 people who witnessed it directly. And in each description, the details would shift in small but meaningful ways. And across the 22 years since that evening, those shifting details would settle into a story told in weight rooms and production offices and martial arts schools from Los Angeles to Auckland, a story whose outline remained constant even as its particulars changed, because the outline was the part that mattered. The man at the table had looked up once. That was enough. The man at the table was Chuck Norris. He had arrived at the Staples Center that evening not as a scheduled participant in the WWE event, but as the guest of a television producer he had known since 1988, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been contracted to document the press event for a cable sports network. Gerald Fitch had secured 2 all-access passes as part of his production agreement, and had offered the second one to Chuck Norris 6 days earlier over dinner in Burbank. Chuck Norris had accepted without asking what the event was or how large it would be. He had arrived 40 minutes before the production window opened. had located a table near the equipment staging area that was out of the main foot traffic corridor, had obtained a cup of coffee from the craft service station, and had sat down to wait for Gerald Fitch to finish setting up his camera positions. He was not there as a celebrity, he was there as a man accompanying a friend to a work obligation. This distinction would matter enormously in approximately 4 minutes. Chuck Norris in March of 2002 was a man whose biography required no introduction in rooms like this one, which is precisely why he preferred rooms where no introduction was necessary. He had begun training in Tang-Soo-do while stationed in South Korea with the United States Air Force in 1958, at the age of 18. In a converted gymnasium behind a base commissary that smelled of pine resin and canvas. He had reached the rank of black belt in 3 years. He had returned to the United States and opened his first martial arts school in Torrance, California in 1962, and in the years that followed he had built a competition record that stood at 168 wins and 10 losses across 11 years of active tournament fighting, with 6 World Professional Middleweight Karate Championship titles and an undefeated record in Tang-Soo-do competition that lasted 4 years before anyone thought to question it publicly. He had trained actors and stuntmen, and law enforcement officers and soldiers. He had been on screen for 30 years. He had founded his own martial art, Chankook-do, and codified its principles in a written system that was being taught in 47 countries by instructors he had personally certified. He was not, in any meaningful sense of the term, a man who needed to prove anything to anyone. He was sitting at a table in a gray Henley drinking coffee. The Rock had come to the staging area because Marcus Webb had said the name, and because 29-year-old men who have spent 11 years becoming the largest, most confident physical presence in most rooms they enter, occasionally find that this lifelong project creates a particular kind of curiosity about the rooms where it might not be true. He had arrived at the table with 2 members of his security detail positioned 3 steps behind him, and the full awareness of a man accustomed to being watched. He had said something. The 11 witnesses who were present in that corridor at that moment would later agree on this. He had said something. They would disagree on the exact words. Because the corridor was not silent, and because the remark had not been directed at them, what they agreed on was the tone, which was the tone of a man making a statement to an audience he expected to be impressed by the statement. One witness, a stunt coordinator named Ray Peralta, who had been standing 4 feet to the left of the equipment rack, would later describe it as the voice a man uses when he believes the room is on his side. The words that have been most consistently reported across the various accounts of that evening were these, or something close to these, that the man at the table might be famous for fighting in movies, but that movies were not the same thing as real fighting. And that if the man at the table ever wanted to find out what the difference felt like, he was available. There were other words in some versions of the account. There was reference, in 3 of the 11 witness testimonies, to an age comment. There was reference, in 2 others, to a remark about the size differential between the 2 men. There was agreement, in all 11 accounts, that the remark was public, delivered at a volume the surrounding witnesses could hear, and that it was intended to establish something in front of people. Chuck Norris set his coffee cup down. He did not set it down quickly. He set it down with the deliberate care of a man completing a small task before beginning another one. The way a carpenter sets down a pencil before picking up a level. He looked at the coffee cup for a moment after setting it down. Then he looked up. He did not stand immediately. What Ray Peralta would describe 20 years later as the most unsettling part of the next 30 seconds was not what Chuck Norris did, it was what he did not do. He did not change his posture. He did not move his chair back. He did not look at the security detail. He did not look at the crowd beyond the corridor entrance. He did not look at the witnesses. He had not raised his voice. He had not smiled. He had not acknowledged the gallery in any way. He had simply looked at the man in front of him with the particular flat attention of someone doing a calculation. Marcus Webb, standing 7 feet away near the equipment rack, would later say that the air in that corridor shifted in a way he could not explain technically, but would describe as the specific silence of a space when something in it becomes more serious than everything surrounding it. Chuck Norris reached up and removed his cap. He folded it once along the brim with 2 fingers, smoothed the fold, and placed it on the table beside the coffee cup. He stood up. He has already lost. He just does not know it yet. From the east wall of the corridor, where a camera operator named Dennis Lim had been adjusting a mounting bracket, the size difference between the two men as Chuck Norris stood was not what anyone had anticipated from the numbers. 262 pounds against 171, 6 feet 5 against 5 feet 10. The numbers should have produced a visual disparity that confirmed the challenger's confidence. What they produced instead was something that 3 of the 11 witnesses would independently describe using variations of the same phrase, that the smaller man looked like he had already accounted for the larger man's size in some prior calculation and had moved on to the next problem. Chuck Norris stood with his arms at his sides. He did not roll his shoulders. He did not shift his weight. He did not widen his stance. He stood the way a man stands when he is waiting for a bus, present, unhurried, and entirely unconcerned about the schedule. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Because what happened in the next 31 seconds is the reason this story has been told in dojos and film lots for 2 decades, and you will want to be here when we get to it. Hit subscribe, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. And let's continue. The Rock had been trained. This is the point that the witnesses who were present in that corridor in March of 2002 would insist upon when the story was told afterward, because the story was easy to misread as a story about inexperience meeting experience, and that was not what it was. Dwayne Johnson had trained in professional wrestling from the age of 22 under the instruction of men who had spent their careers in legitimate athletic preparation. He understood body mechanics. He understood leverage and positioning, and the use of mass. He had spent 11 years putting 262 pounds of himself through training protocols that most recreational athletes could not sustain for a single session. He was not untrained. He was not reckless. He was 29 years old, and he had never in his life been in a corridor with a man who looked at him the way Chuck Norris was looking at him. A fight is not two bodies exchanging force. A fight is a conversation about space, and the first question in that conversation is always who controls the distance between the two parties. At 8 feet of separation, the man with the longer reach has the theoretical advantage. At 6 feet, that advantage begins to complicate. At 4 feet, against a man who has spent 43 years training specifically for the distance at which large men feel comfortable and smaller men do not, the conversation changes entirely. Chuck Norris's entire competitive philosophy had been built around the recognition that a man who controls the closing distance controls the fight, and that the closing distance is controlled not in the moment of closing but in the 3 seconds before it. He waited. He had not moved yet. The distance between the two men was approximately 7 feet. Ray Peralta, to the left of the equipment rack, would later describe what he saw in the following seconds in these precise terms. He said that the large man moved first, and that the movement was confident and direct. The movement of a man who had closed the distance on other men before, and who expected that closing to produce the result it had always produced, which was a reorganization of the space in his favor. Second 1. The Rock moved. 1 step forward, weight transferring to the lead foot. Hands beginning to come up from his sides in the instinctive preparation of a large man who has been physically confident his entire adult life, and who closes distance the way large men close distance, which is with the assumption that the closing itself is the statement. He did not block it. He did not step back from it. He moved at an angle to it. Second 2. Chuck Norris moved right and slightly forward, not back. Forward, the angle was 7 degrees off the direct line of approach, which is not a number any of the witnesses would have been able to report in the moment, but which Ray Peralta, who had spent 17 years as a stunt coordinator studying body mechanics professionally, would later reconstruct from his memory of the geometry of what he saw. 7 degrees. Enough to move the anticipated point of contact past the shoulder, not enough to look like retreat. The movement was so small and so early that 3 of the 11 witnesses would later say when asked to describe it that Chuck Norris had not moved at all. which is perhaps the most precise description of what the movement actually was. It was the movement of a man who had made the other man's movement irrelevant before the other man had finished making it. Dennis Lim, at the camera mounting bracket on the east wall, stopped adjusting the bracket. A television journalist named Sandra Owens, who had been reviewing notes on a clipboard 6 feet from the corridor entrance, looked up from the clipboard and did not look back down. Gerald Fitch, Chuck Norris's friend and the man whose all-access pass had brought him to this building, was 30 feet away on the other side of the equipment staging area. He would later say that he did not see the first 2 seconds. He would say that the first thing he saw was the 3rd second, and that by the time he registered what he was seeing, it was over. Second 3. Chuck Norris's left hand came up and made contact with the inside of the extended right forearm of the man in front of him. Not a strike. A redirect. The contact was the kind of contact that a man makes when he is not trying to hurt the thing he is touching but is simply changing its direction. The way a river changes the direction of a tributary by existing where it exists. The forearm went outward. The shoulder followed the forearm. The shoulder's movement changed the angle of the upper body. The upper body's angle change altered the distribution of 262 pounds in a way that made the next half second geometrically inevitable. 4th second. The weight did not fall, it settled. There is a difference, and the difference is in the degree of control exerted by the man causing it. A fall is unguided. A settlement is guided to a specific destination by a hand or a foot or a forearm that has decided where the settlement should conclude, and has arranged the geometry of the preceding 3 seconds to make that destination the only available one. Chuck Norris's right hand was at the shoulder. The pressure was not large. It did not need to be large. The geometry had already done the work. 262 pounds settled to one knee on the corridor floor of the Staples Center. The sound was not the sound of a collision, it was the sound of weight finding the ground in a controlled way. Ray Peralta would later say it sounded like someone setting down something heavy that they had been careful with. Dennis Lim had not finished adjusting the bracket. Sandra Owens had not moved. Gerald Fitch from 30 feet away saw a man kneeling on the corridor floor, and another man standing beside him, and understood, in the way that people who have known someone for a long time understand things without needing them explained, exactly what had happened and roughly how long it had taken. Chuck Norris stood beside the kneeling man. His breathing had not changed. His shirt was undisturbed. He had not raised his voice. He had not raised his hands above the level of the other man's shoulder at any point in the preceding 4 seconds. He looked down. The finishing movement, which had been building from the geometry of the preceding 3 seconds, was present in the position of Chuck Norris's right foot. It was beside the kneeling man's left knee, positioned with a precision that Ray Peralta, the stunt coordinator, would later describe as the positioning of a man who had placed a foot in exactly that spot beside exactly that knee in exactly that relationship to exactly that body weight enough times to do it without thinking about where the foot needed to be. The foot was still, it had not moved, it had simply arrived at the location that the preceding 3 seconds had made necessary. And then, Chuck Norris did something that every witness in that corridor would remember, and that none of them would fully agree on afterward, because the thing he did was small and quiet and located in the space between what had happened and what was going to happen next. He reached down with his right hand, not to strike, not to hold, to offer. The hand was open, palm up, extended at the level of the kneeling man's shoulder, close enough to take. Ray Peralta, to the left of the equipment rack, would later say that the corridor was absolutely silent for the 2 seconds that the hand remained extended. He would say that 20,000 people on the other side of a wall were producing a noise that he could feel in his chest, and that in the corridor itself there was no sound at all. Chuck Norris said something. He said it quietly, not in a whisper, but at the volume that a man uses when he is speaking to one person and is not interested in having anyone else hear. The witnesses closest to him would later report that they heard the sound of words but could not reconstruct the words themselves. What they reported was not the content but the quality. that the voice was even, that there was no triumph in it, that it sounded, as Dennis Lim would put it many years later in an interview he gave for a martial arts documentary, less like a man who had just won something, and more like a man who was completing a task and moving on to the next one. The precise words were not recorded and have not been definitively established in any of the accounts gathered in the years since. What has been reported most consistently in 4 of the 11 witness accounts and in a conversation that Gerald Fitch describes having with Chuck Norris over dinner approximately 2 months after the event, is that the words were few, that they were direct, and that they contained something that could be understood as an acknowledgement of the other man's real ability, and a suggestion that the real ability was not the thing that had created the problem. The hand remained extended. The man on the floor of the corridor at the Staples Center on March 14, 2002 was 29 years old, and had, in the preceding 3 years, become one of the most physically confident men in the most physically confident entertainment industry in the world. He had been on the receiving end of 20,000 people's admiration less than 25 minutes ago. He was kneeling on a corridor floor in front of 11 witnesses and a man who was holding out a hand and waiting. He had a choice. The choice was the kind of choice that tells you more about a man than any of the choices he makes when his options are comfortable. He could take the hand and say what needed to be said and carry the weight of what that meant, or he could reconstruct the preceding 31 seconds in terms that redistributed the weight in a more bearable direction. Both options were available. Both options had been taken by men in similar positions before him, and the record of which option produced which kind of life afterward was available to anyone willing to read it. Dwayne Johnson looked at the hand for a moment. Then he took it. He stood up, he said something. Whatever he said was said directly at close range, in a voice that the witnesses could not hear. Chuck Norris listened. He nodded once, and then, according to Gerald Fitch, he said something brief in return, the substance of which Fitch would later describe as the kind of thing you say to a man who has just done the harder of 2 available things. Chuck Norris turned and walked back to the table. He picked up his cap. He put it back on his head. He sat down and picked up his coffee cup. The corridor began to breathe again. Ray Peralta went back to the equipment rack. Dennis Lim went back to the mounting bracket. Sandra Owens looked back down at her clipboard. Gerald Fitch finished checking his camera positions and came back to the table 12 minutes later and sat down across from his friend and did not mention what he had witnessed, because Chuck Norris had not brought it up. And Gerald Fitch had known him long enough to understand that this was the appropriate response. The story spread the way certain stories spread, not in press releases or official accounts, but in the particular transmission system of people who were there and people who knew people who were there. Ray Peralta told it to a stunt performer named Kevin Marsh at a production meeting in Burbank 3 weeks after the event. Kevin Marsh told a version of it to a fight choreographer named Thomas Yee over lunch in Studio City in June of that year. Thomas Yee told a version of it to a group of students at his martial arts school in Pasadena in the fall. And the students carried versions of it into their own training contexts, and by the time the story had traveled 18 months and crossed 2 time zones, some of the details had changed, and some of the details had grown, and a few new details had appeared that had not been present at the Staples Center in March of 2002, but that made the story rounder and more portable and therefore easier to carry. The version told in Auckland by 2005 had Chuck Norris arriving at the event specifically to attend a training seminar. The version circulating in British martial arts schools by 2007 had the altercation taking place on the main event floor in full view of the entire press corps. The version told at a self-defense conference in Toronto in 2010 had the 4 seconds condensed to a single movement, and the private sentence expanded into a 2-paragraph speech. None of these alterations were malicious. They were the natural consequence of a true story passing through enough human memory to accumulate the weight of what the story meant beyond its literal facts. The literal facts remained what they were. 31 seconds, 7 feet of initial distance, 1 redirect, one settling, one extended hand, one choice, one nod. Dwayne Johnson's career in the years that followed has been documented in considerable detail elsewhere. And what is worth noting in the context of this story is not the scale of what he built, which was extraordinary, but the particular way he has spoken about physical discipline and respect in the many interviews he has given over the 2 decades since. He has spoken about these subjects with a consistency and a precision that the people who were in that corridor in March of 2002 might recognize as the language of a man who learned something at close range from someone who already knew it. Chuck Norris gave no interview about the event at any point in the years that followed. He did not bring it up in any of the public conversations, promotional appearances, or written accounts he produced in the subsequent 2 decades. There is no record of him correcting any of the versions of the story as they traveled, including the versions that reduced the 31 seconds to a single movement, and the versions that added details that were not there. He appears to have been entirely indifferent to what the story became after he left the corridor. Gerald Fitch, in a 2019 conversation with a podcast host who was producing a series on martial arts history, described the evening at the Staples Center in terms that have stayed consistent across every telling he has given. He said that the most accurate thing he could report about what happened in that corridor was not any specific detail of the 31 seconds, but the quality of the hour that followed, in which he and Chuck Norris had sat at the table near the equipment staging area, finished their coffee, watched the remaining portion of the WWE press event through the corridor entrance, and spoken about a documentary film that Fitch was developing about the history of American martial arts schools in the 1960s. He said Chuck Norris had been interested in the documentary and had offered to connect Fitch with 3 former training partners who might be willing to give interviews. He said Chuck Norris had not mentioned the man in the corridor once. There is a thing that certain men learn, usually late and usually at cost, which is that the largest person in any room is not the person who occupies the most physical space. The largest person in any room is the person who requires the least from the room in order to know who they are. Chuck Norris had learned this thing in a converted gymnasium behind a base commissary in South Korea in 1958. And he had been carrying it in every room he had entered since, including the corridor behind the East Press Riser at the Staples Center in Los Angeles on the night of March 14, 2002, where he had set it down briefly to let one other man examine it, and then picked it back up without ceremony and taken it home. What the room confirms and what you carry without confirmation are 2 entirely different inventories. A man who knows the difference rarely needs to demonstrate it. When he does, it does not take long. Next week, we will examine the evening in Las Vegas in 1987, when a decorated Army Ranger walked into a training session Chuck Norris was running for a private security detail, and made a specific request in front of 12 armed professionals that nobody in that room had heard made before, and what Chuck Norris said in response, which was not what any of the 12 armed professionals expected. And why the Army Ranger would spend the next 3 years sending letters to a post office box in Garland, Texas, that Chuck Norris has never publicly acknowledged receiving.